wasn't just hated, he was condemned by his court, by his church, by history itself. They called him a king, but he ruled like a curse. He starved noblewomen in silence, melted holy relics for gold, and mocked the Pope with every coin he squeezed from his dying people. When Rome excommunicated him, he laughed. When England begged for mercy, he tightened the chains. And when he finally died, bloated, raving, and alone, no one wept. No one prayed. Even the priests stayed silent. If Joan died because the church feared her faith, John lived because he feared no God, and he ruled like hell itself sat on the throne. But monsters aren't born with crowns. They're made in the shadows of stronger men. Before he became a tyrant, John was nothing. Born in 1166 to King Henry II and Elena of Aquitaine, he was the youngest of 5 sons, an afterthought in a dynasty of giants. While his older brothers were granted castles, duchies, and crowns, John was given nothing. No inheritance, no lands, no real place in the royal machine. They called him John Lackland, and the name wasn't just cruel, it was prophetic. But it wasn't just about land. John grew up surrounded by betrayal. His brothers Henry, the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, fought bitterly against each other and against their father. His mother Elena, once the most powerful queen in Europe, was thrown into prison by her own husband. John watched it all, loyalty crushed, ambition rewarded, and mercy buried under iron. Where others learned chivalry, John learned survival. He saw that love was dangerous, weakness was fatal, and the crown belonged not to the rightful, but to the ruthless. And in that chaos, a bitterness took root. He didn't just want land. He wanted control, and he would bleed England dry to get it. He watched Richard ride for the Holy Land like a god in armor, the crowds roaring, the trumpets blaring, and John, forgotten in the shadows, just watched. His older brother was everything he was. Tall, golden, beloved, and hungry for crusade and glory. But John saw something else in that departure. He saw an empty throne, and he smiled. When word came that Richard had been captured in the Alps on his way home, chained in a German dungeon, alone, far from England, John didn't pray for his safe return. He sent letters, not to rescue his brother, but to bargain for the crown. He wrote to King Philip of France, offering loyalty. He spread whispers through the kingdom, Richard is dead, long live the new king. He even tried to seize the royal treasury and marry Richard's betrothed, claiming the throne by force and scandal. And for a brief, shivering moment, it almost worked. But fate wasn't done with him yet. Richard returned, richer in myth, furious in silence, and he remembered everything: the letters, the lies, the land John had stolen. But instead of drawing his sword, Richard did something worse. He forgave him, in public at least. Behind the walls of palace halls, John was stripped of power, shamed like a dog. Barons laughed at him. Servants whispered. His own mother, Elena of Aquitaine, refused to speak with him. Richard's mercy wasn't kindness, it was humiliation, and John felt it. Deeply, he knelt, waiting for the axe, and heard instead, "You're not even worth killing." That broke something. Mercy rotted him faster than vengeance ever could. He became the man who lived, not because he won, but because the victor wanted him to suffer. And then, in 1199, fate handed him the crown anyway. Richard died. Not in battle, not on a golden throne, but by the filthy hand of a peasant rebel. An arrow to the shoulder, infected, festering, and John, he didn't mourn, he didn't cry. He walked to the throne, looked down at his brother's corpse, and said nothing. Because for the first time in his life, there were no more brothers, no more Richard, no more shadows above him, just power and him finally at the center of the fire. But what he inherited wasn't unity. It was a kingdom fraying at the edges, nobles whispering revolt, and foreign powers eyeing the realm like vultures circling a dying beast. The crown was his, but it was leaking blood. The crown fit his head, but not the kingdom. From the moment John was crowned, the throne beneath him creaked. England wasn't mourning Richard, it was bracing for John. The nobles who once pledged loyalty now watched him with cold, measuring eyes. The church offered prayers with clenched jaws. Even his own barons whispered, "Is this really our king?" John tried to command authority like Richard, but he was Richard. He had no battlefield legend, no lion's charisma. What he had was suspicion, bitterness, and a long memory for insults. And that made him dangerous. His first crisis came fast. A teenage boy named Arthur, his own nephew, son of his late brother Geoffrey, stepped forward and claimed the throne. In the eyes of many, Arthur had the stronger bloodline, more legitimate, cleaner. French nobles backed him, so did the King of France. Suddenly, John wasn't just a new monarch, he was a usurper. War broke out in the north of France, and the whispers turned into swords. John crushed Arthur's forces near Mayabeau in 1202, captured the boy, and dragged him away in chains. England cheered, but then Arthur vanished. No trial, no ransom, no announcement, just gone. The official records are silent. But stories leaked, ugly, raw stories. That John murdered him with his bare hands during a drunken rage. That he had the boy's body dumped in the river, weighed down with stones. That Arthur screamed for mercy in a castle cell while his uncle watched with dead eyes. Whether the stories were true didn't matter. They stuck. The French were outraged. Even English barons felt a line had been crossed. Arthur had been young, royal, and defenseless, and John had made him disappear. But he didn't stop there. He began seizing lands from nobles he suspected of disloyalty. He raised taxes brutally, not to rebuild the kingdom, but to fund more war, more bribes, more control. He squeezed the realm like a wolf gnawing a broken limb. And slowly, the people of England realized something horrifying. This wasn't just a bad king. This was a predator with a crown. And the more he felt the kingdom slipping through his fingers, the harder he squeezed. Soon, no one felt safe. Not barons, not bishops, not even the men who dined at his table. And in the dark, behind closed doors, his mind began to twist. If power couldn't be earned, it had to be enforced. He stopped pretending. No more diplomacy, no more patience. The crown wasn't a symbol, it was a weapon, and King John wielded it like a blade. He ruled with suspicion, silence, and sudden cruelty. Anyone could be a traitor. Everyone was guilty until proven useful. The barons who hesitated to kneel were fined into oblivion. Castles were seized. He extorted payments from widows and orphans. He didn't just tax the realm, he drained it. Not to build roads or strengthen defenses, but to fuel his obsession with control. Every coin was another brick in his fortress of fear. But it wasn't just about money. John wanted obedience. And when he didn't get it, he turned to terror. Take the case of Matilda de Breos. Her husband had once served John loyally, until he questioned the king's treatment of hostages. That was enough. John declared them enemies. He seized their lands, hunted them down like animals. Matilda and her eldest son were captured and thrown into Windsor Castle. No trial, no verdict, just a locked door. Then he cut off their food. For days, the guards heard nothing. Then screaming, then silence. When the door was finally opened, there were two corpses in the dark, twisted, starved, and half consumed. Some whispered the mother had tried to feed on the son to survive. Others said John had watched it unfold from behind a slit in the wall. It wasn't an isolated case. Noble families disappeared. Daughters of barons were held hostage, their lives ransomed back piece by piece. One girl was sent home blind in one eye, John's signature, they said, for a late payment. He ruled not by loyalty, but by fear. He created prisons where there had been castles. Halls of laughter became torture chambers. And worst of all, he enjoyed it. There were rumors he carried a black ledger where he wrote the names of every noble he intended to break. Not kill, break, and the realm could feel it, not just the nobles, but the common people. Villages taxed into starvation, merchants ruined, clergy stripped of protection. The law became a joke. Justice was for sale, or worse, a trap. He was no longer a king. He was a storm wrapped in silk, a face carved in cruelty. And he wore the crown not to lead, but to dominate. But domination breeds defiance. And far from the throne, behind tapestries and stone walls, those he thought cowed were beginning to gather, and sharpen steel in the dark. Across the Channel, the ghosts of his ancestors began to slip away. Normandy, crown jewel of his lineage, the very land conquered by William the Bastard over a century ago, was now crumbling in his hands. John's war in France wasn't just a failure, it was a humiliation. His enemies didn't just outfight him, they outmaneuvered him. Where his father had crushed kings and his brother inspired fear, John flailed like a child in a storm. Then came Arthur. His teenage nephew, rightful heir to the Plantagenet line, stood against him with French support. John captured him, but instead of parading his victory, he made Arthur vanish. No trial, no farewell, just silence. People whispered John strangled him himself. Others said he had the boy drowned in secret. Whatever happened, the stain was permanent. The French declared war, nobles defected, and Normandy, the land that birthed England's royal blood, was lost. John didn't just lose a duchy, he lost the spine of his legitimacy. What his ancestors had carved out with blood, he pissed away in paranoia. And back in England, those watching from their keeps and cathedrals began to murmur. If he can lose Normandy, what will he destroy next? At some point, John stopped fearing men and started challenging God. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died in 1205, John saw an opportunity. He wanted a puppet, someone he could control. But Rome had other plans. Pope Innocent III, a man not known for mercy, handpicked a reformer, Stephen Langton, a scholar, a man of principle, everything John hated. So John refused, flat out, blocked Langton from entering England, declared him an enemy. The Pope responded with a nuclear option, interdict. Churches across England were shut, bells silenced, masses banned, no marriages, no funerals, no last rites. The realm was plunged into spiritual darkness. For the first time in living memory, even the dead could not be buried in consecrated ground. And John, he laughed. While England panicked, he seized church lands, looted monasteries, arrested priests. Clergy who resisted were mutilated or vanished. He took holy relics and melted them for coin. To him, the church wasn't sacred, it was a bank. God was just another landlord he refused to pay, but the Pope escalated further. In 1209, John was excommunicated, spiritually cut off from Christendom. Worse, in 1212, Innocent declared John deposed and offered the English crown to King Philip of France. It wasn't just a curse anymore. It was an open invitation for foreign invasion. Suddenly, John wasn't invincible. He was isolated, hated by Rome, distrusted by his barons, and now under threat of a French crusade. The man who'd once starved noblewomen was now being starved politically, cornered by forces he couldn't imprison or bleed. So he broke. In 1213, John did something no English king had ever done. He knelt. On the floor of a stone chapel before the papal env, he removed his crown and offered it to the Pope, not in symbolism, literally. He surrendered the entire kingdom of England and Ireland to Rome, then begged to receive it back as a vassal. He even agreed to pay annual tribute, and Rome accepted. John was forgiven, spiritually restored, politically protected, but the nobles, they were livid, because in their eyes, their king had just sold England to a foreign priest in exchange for his own skin. He hadn't protected the realm, he had bartered it like a thief pawning stolen silver. From that day on, John was no longer just a tyrant. He was a traitor to the crown itself, and those who once feared him now began to wonder. What happens when the predator starts bleeding? Power didn't calm him, it unhinged him. After his public surrender to the Pope, John returned to his court not as a humbled man, but as a cornered animal with teeth bared. He had submitted to a higher power to save his skin, but in his mind, it was everyone else who had betrayed him. And now they had to pay. He no longer trusted anyone. His barons, spies, his advisors, liars. Even his closest household knights were rotated constantly, interrogated, threatened. Loyalty was meaningless. Only fear lasted. He created an inner circle of informants, men who watched other men, who reported whispers, glances, pauses at dinner. One knight spoke too softly to a noblewoman. The next day he was found strangled in the stables. Another hesitated before toasting the king. A week later, his tongue was nailed to a monastery door. The court fell silent. No laughter. No music. Only the sounds of boots echoing down stone corridors and doors closing softly, then locking from the outside. Records of this period are incomplete. Some say deliberately destroyed. But the rumors remain. That John had prisoners walled up alive beneath Nottingham Castle. That he had his own cousin starved to death in secret for hesitating during a campaign. That during one winter, he personally oversaw the torture of several barons' sons, children held hostage to ensure their father's obedience. That he smiled while doing it. The walls of power began to crack. Entire noble families fled to France. Others began forming secret alliances, slipping letters through priests and merchants, begging for outside intervention. They couldn't challenge him openly, not yet, but even monsters leave trails of blood, and John's were everywhere. He tried to buy loyalty with gold, but his coffers were near empty. He tried to enforce order with fear, but fear had limits. What happens when your soldiers no longer follow, when your nobles no longer kneel, when the people cheer your death before it's even announced? He had become the most powerful man in England, but he sat on a throne of ghosts, surrounded by silence, paranoia, and hatred, a king feared by all and loved by none. And in the shadows of England's great halls, the whispers grew louder. One word, one idea, one plan: rebellions. By 1215, the kingdom had had enough. John's cruelty had pushed even the proudest barons to the edge. The disappearances, the taxes, the betrayals. He wasn't ruling anymore, he was suffocating the realm, and so the nobility rose. Quietly at first, then with banners, then with swords, they seized London, not by bloodshed, but because the gates were opened from within. No one wanted to die for John anymore. Isolated and desperate, he was forced to negotiate. And what came out of that negotiation was not a peace, it was a prison. At a meadow called Runnymede, beneath grey skies and surrounded by armed lords, King John was handed a document. It wasn't a treaty, it was a muzzle. It told him, "You are not above the law. You will not steal, torture, imprison without reason. You will answer to us." It was called Magna Carta, the Great Charter. But to John, it was a collar. He didn't sign it with dignity. He signed it with fury barely contained behind a trembling hand. Not because he believed in its words, but because the sword pressed against his throat had finally drawn blood. He never intended to honor it. Within weeks, he appealed to the Pope, had the charter annulled, and declared every rebel baron an enemy of the crown. War returned. The ink wasn't even dry before John tore the parchment apart, figuratively, and some say literally. But it was too late. Magna Carta had escaped him. The end didn't come on a battlefield. It didn't come with banners or swords or shouts of glory. It came with mud, with vomit, with rot. It came in the night, quiet and putrid, like the man himself. In October 1216, John was on the run. The rebellion he'd tried to crush had consumed the country. Foreign armies marched on his soil. The barons had invited a French prince to take his throne. Even his mercenaries had begun to abandon him. He was no longer king, he was prey. Fleeing across the fens of East Anglia, John lost his treasure wagons in a flood, not metaphorically, literally. His entire royal fortune, gold, jewels, relics, sank into the river wash gone. Some say he watched from horseback as it disappeared beneath the muck, and something in him just snapped. That night he feasted. Out of spite, out of madness, out of hunger, no one knows. Goose, eel stew, wine, heavy food poured into a stomach already rotting from the inside. Within hours he was vomiting, writhing, raving. His gut swelled. His skin flushed purple. He shat blood. Some say his screams could be heard echoing from the abbey walls like the howls of a dying animal. Others whispered that he'd been poisoned, not by rebels, but by someone in his own camp. A servant, a priest, maybe even his own son. There was no dignity, no final blessing. No one sang for him, no one wept. He died alone in Newark Castle, clutching at his belly, drenched in sweat and filth, cursing names no one recognized. And when they found his body, bloated and stinking, the priests hesitated. Even in death, John terrified them. They buried him quickly, unceremoniously in Worcester Cathedral, far from London, far from kings, far from legacy. Not one soul in the kingdom mourned him, and in the silence that followed, England exhaled. For the first time in years, the shadow was gone, but the stain remained. He died hated, mocked, unloved, but John left behind something even he couldn't destroy: consequence. The barons who had forced his trembling hand onto the Magna Carta thought it was just a temporary fix, a leash for one monster. But the ink they spilled at Runnymede would echo across centuries. Kings who came after John were forced to reissue it, refine it, expand it. The idea grew legs, teeth, and law that a king, any king, must bow to something greater than himself. The rule of law. From those smudged Latin words came the seeds of parliament, of constitutional monarchy, of justice systems in lands he never even knew existed. America, Canada, India, Australia. They all traced pieces of their freedoms to the paper that bled out from under John's crown. He never meant to be a reformer. He was a tyrant, a thug with a scepter. But like rot feeding the soil, his ruin fertilized something larger, not because he was wise, but because he was feared. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate irony. John of England, the most hated monarch in the history of the realm, became the accidental father of liberty. Not through vision, not through virtue, but through failure. His name lives not in gold, but in warning. That was the story of King John, the tyrant who ruled by fear, died in filth, and accidentally laid the foundation for everything he tried to crush. If you love dark history, royal downfalls, or just wild true stories from the past, you're in the right place. There's more where that came from.